All right, stats students, we're going to continue. We're moving on to the next part of this chapter. 4.2 is experiments. So in your notes, you can draw a line and then title it with this right here. And we're going to be talking about experiments. We've discussed some of the studies that have happened with the cigarette smoking, the vaping, and all that, and we looked at all of those. But now we're going to talk about how to sort of create a good experiment, okay? And the first thing that we want to talk about is these two differences here. So you have what's called an observational study, and then you also have what's called an experiment. Okay, so you're going to go ahead and write down these two examples, or these two definitions. Okay, so observational study observes individuals and measures variable of interest, but does not attempt to influence responses. An experiment deliberately imposes some treatment on individuals to measure their response. So, okay, I want you to answer a question. The cigarette smoking video that we watched, all the research that happened in there, okay, was the research they were doing an observational study or an experiment? Let's see what you say. Okay, so the answer should be an observational study, okay? They can't run an experiment in this case because they can't force people to smoke, and that would be unethical to do that. And in the video, the lady had joked about that. We could easily show causation or prove this if we could start the babies off at birth, make half of them smoke and the other half not, and then compare the death rates later on. Okay, no, you can't do that. That's dangerous. So you can only use observational studies for things like that. Okay, so and right here, when we're trying to show cause and effect, experiments are the only source of fully convincing data. Experiments show cause and effect, observational studies don't. But it takes a long time, and that's what we talked about. They were able to prove that smoking causes cancer, but it took forever, okay? But experiments are the way to fully convince yourself. They did end up running experiments on animals, and sometimes that's what happens to find the proof, okay? The issue with the observational studies is the idea of confounding. We already wrote this definition down. It was my intro. But it's hard to tell in an observational study what's causing the actual effect itself. Okay. So we don't have to write confound. We already wrote it. Let's talk about the language of experiments. Okay. So an experiment, we're actually doing something. The observational study, we're not. So in an experiment, we have what's called a treatment. That's what helps you distinguish if it's an experiment or not. We are giving the units something, giving the people in the experiment something to do or something to take, or we're applying, and what we have here, a specific condition applied to the individuals in the experiment. So you can write that down. Okay, so the experimental units. So experimental units is the next definition. This is just part of the lingo for experiments. It's the smallest collection of individuals which the treatments are applied, and then we have subjects, which are just units that are human. So human beings in an experiment. Okay. All right, so let's talk about what we're going to talk about now is experimental design and how to actually create a good experiment. We want it to follow a process, and it's vastly more complicated when you're dealing with living organisms, animals, or even humans. Okay, so in a science class, it's usually pretty straightforward. So you've probably run an experiment in science before. And this is usually the model that they follow. You don't have to write anything on here, but check this out. They take the experimental units, and sometimes in a science class, that's just a vial of something. They apply a treatment, maybe another chemical, and you see what happens. And that works in like a lab, and that's fine, okay? But if I just take experimental units, let's say I take my entire stats class, I give them one item, maybe I want to see how long it takes them to write one sentence, right? With a crayon. Okay, how long does it take the average person to write one sentence with a crayon. This is just a dumb example. And then I just measure those. But the problem is, I don't have anything to compare with. Okay, maybe my question should have been, is writing with a crayon faster than, say, a pencil? And in that case, I need groups. Okay, I need comparison to see if it's actually effective or not. All right. So this model doesn't work well when we're talking about statistics, when we're doing research with humans. Okay. So here's how we're going to experiment well. So go ahead and write this down, and you'll title this section. We're making a lot of sections in our notes. How to experiment well. So the remedy for confounding is to perform a comparative experiment. We want to compare one group of individuals to another. In which some units receive one treatment and similar units receive another. So we need two balanced groups. Okay. So for that comparison. Now, if we're going to make two groups, let's say we get our sample and we want to split them into groups. And let's say that I did this with my students. I want to compare writing speed with a crayon to writing speed of a pencil. Now, some groups are just going to be better at writing. You know, they're just going to be better at writing sentences. They're just faster. Their handwriting is more efficient. So how do we make sure the groups are balanced so that we can really see a difference between them? Well, the answer is random assignment. So go ahead and write random assignment. And that is this. Experimental units are assigned to treatments using chance process. So we already know how to use random chance to select things, but each individual in your sample would be sent here. You're going to this group, you're going to this group, you're going to this group, so on and so forth. Okay? So that's an important part of this. So we have principles of design, and you're going to have a homework sheet that goes along with this lesson, and you're going to have to quote these principles of design. So let's write these down. In a good experiment, these 4 items have to be observed. Okay? So you can simplify this list however you want. Just write principles of experimental design, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. And I've highlighted what you need to write. So I'll give you a moment to write that. I'm going to pause the video. Okay, so we've already talked about comparison. You want to compare 2 or more treatments, and that comes from having multiple groups. So you could have 3 groups, 4 groups, 5 groups, it doesn't matter. But each group has a second, we're going to use the second principle, random assignment. We have to use chance to send people to each group, okay? Next, something we have talking about, control. Keep other variables that might affect the response the same for all groups, okay? And then lastly, replication. It's just use enough experimental units in each group. And we're going to go ahead, we need to write all of that because it's all important. We want to do that. Use enough units in each group so that any differences in the effects of the treatments can be distinguished from chance differences between the groups. We need enough people. I don't want to just put 4 in each group. Let's say 4 people write with a crayon, 4 people write with a pencil. We don't really want that. We need more people to really show a big difference, okay? Because it could just be chance that we have certain types of people within these groups that have special skills of writing, okay? So we need a large group as much as possible. So that's replication. All right, the last part of this lesson that we're going to talk about is the perfect design, okay? The perfect design is what's called a completely randomized design, all right? Treatments are assigned to all the experimental units completely by chance. So our experimental units, this is also known as the sample. And I would like you to copy this chart down. So once you write these definitions up here, we're going to have this chart down. Some experiments may include what's called a control group. Okay, control group receives an inactive treatment or an existing baseline treatment. In my example that I've talked about, that would be a pencil, right? So we're asking the question, does writing with a crayon affect speed of writing compared to a pencil? So that's our control group would get the pencils, okay? All right, so copy this design down. You can use this in your homework. All right, and this is sort of the go-to design. All right, we'll see you next lesson.